economy had to do with the fact that people more or less trust one another in the context of having some kind of exchange of value of some sort. And I guess you could summarize our current situation like this, where you have a group of people who are you and me and everybody else you know, highlighted in blue, who are making some kind of business with businesses, I guess, highlighted in purple. We make money and have our money from corporate banks, your banking institution as a whole, and those corporate banks also do business with the businesses. Meanwhile, between the corporate banks and the central bank, you have the exchange of currency. So the central bank issues and values currency. The currency is passed on to the corporate bank. The corporate bank distributes the money to you and the businesses. The money is owed back to the corporate banks of some sort. The larger idea behind the central bank was mostly for government to avoid the possibility of barter systems, because barter systems are outside of the realm of the social groups, essentially. So having a public way in which money can be transferred as opposed to a private way according to which money can be transferred, assuming, of course, that there are going to be some private money exchanges as well. Having the central bank kind of short circuits that and allows for the money to be publicly available, at least to a certain extent, as far as the government is concerned, because as we talked about on Friday, the value of the US dollar is based in large part around the business that is being done at all times. Now, of course, before we had currency, before we had money, anyone who owned land had the possibility to produce their own necessities and to trade that with others. And of course, as a result of that, the people who had access to land and had access to the thing of value pretty much had unlimited access to value as a result of that, and with fewer ways for people to access any kind of money after that. And in fact, of course, most of that changed after the Civil War, when well, actually before the Civil War, as a result of the Civil War in 1861, Lincoln signs the Revenue Act, which begins the income tax system in the United States. Up until that point, tax was only applying to estates, real estate. Then it becomes part of revenue as a result of that, to allow for everyone who has any kind of income in the United States to participate into the US economy, more or less. Of course, the change of the Civil War also means that land was redistributed and the general activity of the United States was redistributed as well. Now, what happens in the modern sense, of course, is that with the possibility of Bitcoin, you are removing the central bank from this picture and removing corporate banks from this picture as well. So the currency would be traded and owed directly between businesses and people and passed on without the control of either corporate banks or central banks in that context. Now, the change here is not very notable in a sense, because you have only the change of a system through another system in which the currency is going to be passed. And of course, this is still a matter of trust, right? So whether or not you trust the central bank for reasons that are mostly due to US policy, whether or not you trust the corporate banks, which are due to, well, private corporate rules. In other words, you don't trust the public rules of the central bank, you don't trust the private rules of the corporate banks, you trust only individuals and whatever they are doing. And lots of that is due to the history of the US government, as well as the history of the corporations in the United States. The larger process behind this is the very large consolidation of banking institutions since especially the 1980s. This is also due to a regulation change that allowed banks to, for the first time in US history, operate across state lines, which up until that point had not necessarily been either easy or allowed. Partly because, of course, the larger system was to make sure that each state had its own way to function. And so once you remove the barriers to banks working interstate, once you remove the barriers to banks working internationally, then there is only a much lower need to have banking institutions. And so since the 80s, especially, banks have been consolidating into increasingly smaller groups, and this happened pretty much throughout the world, of course. Again, this is due partly to the technology becoming easier, partly to the need for people to have transactions on a much larger scale. So Bitcoin in this case would be kind of a sequel to all of this. Now, people who do not trust either public systems or private systems have the possibility to create their own sense of value based on essentially their own sense of trust among others. And of course, the result of that is the wide swings that we have talked about on Friday. That being said, the large swings that happened because of the Civil War also happened in the Bitcoin market as well. For example, in 2013, when the price of Bitcoin crashed absurdly low, as it had done before already twice. But in 2013, the main driver that was identifiable was the fact that China, who was one of the largest place where Bitcoin was traded, mostly because they have a large population, but also because they are uh, able to have access to the technology, and because the banking system is very much controlled there. All of the Bitcoin that was being traded in China was stopped very briefly as the Chinese government made a statement that that Bitcoin was not legal tender. Now, as this LA Times article points out here, the Chinese government did not ban Bitcoin. However, they just said that these were that Bitcoin were just not essentially legal money, and that the Chinese government would not adapt it, which of course that fixed itself, that situation fixed itself once the market and people who do Bitcoin realized that it was not an all-out interdiction. So the larger idea here was that the Chinese government was seeing that Bitcoin was impeding on its own currency, and that as a result of that, the people who are trading Bitcoin were considered to be a liability to the state. So the government made a statement which crashed Bitcoin, and also because of the way that things worked, the Chinese currency was also on the uptrend. And so a lot of people who up until that point were not particularly trustful of the Chinese government became a lot more trustful of the US government. And a lot of people who distrusted the government up until that point also figured out that Bitcoin was not such a big deal. So, the system kind of evened out in that sense, and caused Bitcoin to crash. So, of course, this is a matter of people taking financial risk and investing in this new technology, which has its ups and downs as a result of that. The other side of this coin, no pun intended, is, for example, in Vanuatu, which is an archipelago in the Pacific Islands, where having access to banks is very difficult because we are talking about several islands spread across the Pacific. We're also talking about very difficult communication with the islands, and especially when there is a hurricane, as it happened some years ago. And so a nonprofit like Oxfam started to deploy a Bitcoin market in Vanuatu to allow for people to pass money very quickly, and also, of course, to allow international aid to reach Vanuatu a lot quicker than it would have otherwise if you had to fly planes there when the infrastructure is destroyed, if you had to pass on any kind of other data. That way, the Bitcoin or the digital currency would be able to pass much more smoothly than that. And so you have a well-established system of cryptocurrency that is already happening in Vanuatu, mostly because there is no government to actually sustain it. So in this case, the bypassing the government is actually solving a problem rather than avoiding a problem as it happens in other places. There's actually another form of quote unquote digital currency that already exists in Vanuatu as well, is because paper money was very easily destroyed lost and there are no corporate banks, or there are very limited corporate banks to have the money, they switched a few years ago to polymer, that is plastic banknotes, which are a lot easier to handle. And of course, because people do not have banks, they typically bury their money into the ground. In that case, the bank notes are much longer lasting when they are made out of plastic. And so there was this existing kind of technology that already existed there to prevent the money from being destroyed due to this lack of infrastructure. So of course, there are definitely some upsides in that case because the non-existence of a infrastructure means that the digital solution here is making up for a gap that existed in a place that developed on a different scale than it did in the rest of the industrial world. By contrast, of course, for the industrial world, which already has this infrastructure, Bitcoin kind of ends up being redundant because this is just another way for people to pass money, and a way that at least needs to prove itself to be reliable, as opposed to government, which has proved itself to be, well, partly reliable, partly unreliable. And again, there's a calculated risk to be done here. When the US government, quote unquote, crashes, it is much less of a swing than it does in Bitcoin, but it is also possible, just doesn't happen as often and as largely as it does for cryptocurrencies, even the strong ones. The other side of this is for other regulations, for example, regulation of illegal substances. And there's a marketplace such as Silk Road, which was mostly based on Bitcoin, that was active from 2011 to 2013, if I remember correctly, when the FBI shut it down. So this is another marketplace, for stuff like eBay or whatever, except this one was based on illegal activity for the most part, and based on Bitcoin, of course. Bitcoin is sometimes, probably too often, marketed as an anonymous currency, but it is not anonymous, of course, because you need to be able to pass the money from one place to the other. And if you need to be able to have money placed from one place to the other, you need to have names attached to this. And therefore, it is actually very much possible, and in fact, it is a design of Bitcoin that you are able to trace money moving from one place to the other. Most of that is just a matter of being able to track down numbers on a sheet of paper, which is just as easy as it is in the rest of the world. So the trade of illegal things, so again, circumventing a regulation of some sort, has become very much associated with the trade of Bitcoin and with the trade of cryptocurrencies, mostly out of a false sense of security that existed there. The founder of this particular market, the Silk Road, was condemned to life in prison in 2015. Many of his other associates had large fines and prison sentences as well, because the system was more or less internationally distributed as a result of that. Now, of course, shutting down Silk Road has not stopped the trade of illegal things, and certainly not stopped Bitcoin from existing either, because those are just means to an end. People who are trying to achieve a certain thing will find ways to achieve that thing. And if that means circumventing existing regulations, well, that is going to be the case, just as it is for most other things around the world, just as governments do that as well. If they try to do something and that is not legally possible, they will find ways around the existing regulations to do it. So the political change that exists as a result of Bitcoin is very minimal in that sense, as it is usually oftentimes when it comes to economy. A lot of people tend to associate economic process with political process, but that is in fact not true and could be further from the truth, because the way that people do economy has very much been dissociated from the politics of it for a very long time. And of course, in places like Vanuatu, it is a necessity, in fact, to separate the politics from the economy. So having the possibility for people to do business does not have such a big impact on the economy, and certainly having the on the politics and having the possibility to politically control the economy also doesn't have that big of an effect on the trade as well. It is just a matter of how people are committing those social relationships.